Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining us from around the world. My name is Ronan Cormacain, and it is my pleasure to host this third in our series of global webinars on global legislative responses to coronavirus. We've had a huge interest from around the world in connection with the special issue of our journal, Theory and Practice of Legislation, on the issues around the legislative response to coronavirus. And we've had two very successful seminars already, and I'm looking forward to our third one today. And I'm very grateful to the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law and BICL, the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, for hosting us today. The webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be online shortly afterwards. Full papers will be available on the website of the journal Theory and Practice of Legislation. Let me now introduce our speakers. We're very privileged to have such a fantastic range of speakers today. From Monash University in Australia, we have Dr. Eric Windholz, who will be speaking on governing in a pandemic from parliamentary democracy to autocratic technocracy. Next, from Israel, Dr. Ittai Bar-Siman-Tov, and he'll be talking about the COVID-19 challenge whenever it meets a political challenge. From America, we have Dr. James Maxiner from Baltimore School of Law, and he'll be discussing a little bit more of the idea of a government of men, not of laws, and how that interacts with our understanding of the rule of laws. Finally, our final paper will be presented by two speakers. First of all, we will have Dr. Csaba Gyuri, and alongside him, Nyasha Weinberg, and they will be discussing the case of Hungary and hybrid emergency powers in a hybrid regime. If you have any questions, if you use the question and answer function in Zoom, and then I will direct your questions to the speakers. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Without more further ado, I will turn over now to Dr. Eric Windholz, who will be discussing the Australian situation. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ronan. I'll just bring up the slide. First of all, thank you, Ronan. I'd also like to thank Ronan, Ittai, and the journal, The Theory and Practice of Legislation, for putting together the special edition of which the paper to which I will speak is part, and also thank the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law for putting on this webinar series. I'm going to be speaking to the situation in Australia, and before I do so, for those who don't know much about Australia, just 2 points I want to make by way of context. First of all, Australia is a federation. So we have a national government, state governments, each of which have powers and responsibilities with respect to both public health and emergency management. The second feature is that we are a parliamentary democracy. Our executive is drawn from the parliament, and as a result, the executive has largely control over parliament, or at least the lower house of our parliament. With respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia has largely followed elements of what is often termed the emergency script. Lawmaking power has been concentrated in the hands of the executive. Parliament has not sat for extended periods of time. Parliamentary oversight committees initially weren't set up, and when they were, are largely operating as ex post reviews rather than real-time scrutiny. The oversight of courts is not being accessed, while freedom of speech has been maintained. Criticism from the media, from civil society has largely been circumspect. Personal freedoms, freedoms of movement, association, to trade, to earn a livelihood have been restricted. Surveillance to enforce those restrictions has been increased, and enforcement has been assigned in part to the military. But there is one feature of Australia's response that deviates, or at least adds to the emergency script, and that is the prominent role that is being played by the medical scientific expert, not a role that you see when emergency is triggered by terrorism or civil unrest or natural disasters. Extensive legislative and executive power has been delegated to these experts. In some jurisdictions directly, in the sense that the expert, him or herself, declares the emergency and exercises the powers enlivened by that declaration, or indirectly to the extent that traditional members of the executive operate on their advice. And the nature of these new governance arrangements are evident in press conferences to which Australians have become accustomed to every day, where the Prime Minister of the country on the left, or a Premier of the state, shown on the right, together with that jurisdiction's Chief Medical Officer, appear before the media every day to announce the current statistics on infections and deaths and the measures that are being introduced to deal with them. And I've labelled this combination the autocratic technocracy, in which the technocrats, the medical scientific experts, play a dominant role, and the traditional checks and balances on the executive, Parliament, the judiciary, and civil society have largely been muted. Now, there are, of course, advantages of an autocratic technocracy. It facilitates timely and decisive decision-making, prioritises evidence-based decision-making, gives that decision-making a rational, apolitical character, and by combining the expert and with the political executive, minimises risks of miscommunication, misunderstanding. It also has the advantage of clothing their decisions with legitimacy of the expertise, and with trust. Restrictions of the kind that are needed to deal with COVID-19 cannot just be done through coercive measures. They need voluntary cooperative action. And research establishes that people are more likely to follow instructions that come from a source that they trust. And research, at least in Australia, establishes that doctors, medical scientists, health professionals are much more trusted than politicians. But when this expertise, and when the expert transitions from advisor to decision maker, and when you combine the status of the expert with the power of the state and the imprimatur of the state, you actually have a very powerful combination. And I've already mentioned that in some jurisdictions, the expert both declares the emergency and exercises the powers. The role of the expert in a public health emergency has an intuitive logic. The expert is also able to contribute to policy debates asymmetrically with other participants. They have a knowledge advantage over the executive and judiciary. The Parliament and judiciary, for example, they also have a purity of motives compared to political, business, and commercial interests. It's also difficult for governments to ignore the advice from the very persons they have put forward as experts. And all of this combines to create a situation where their participation can marginalise consideration of alternative views and can lock in policy directions. But there are risks with an autocratic technocracy. The first risk is that experts can make errors. They're dealing with incomplete information in a rapidly changing environment. Experts can also be very overly narrow in focus. Medical experts come from, have their own specialised functional and professional expertise, and they operate in like-minded communities of professionals who share their worldviews, their beliefs, their expectations, their hypotheses about the issue at hand. And all of this can contribute to experts having their own cognitive biases. They can have what's called confirmation or disconfirmation bias, where they interpret evidence in ways that are partial to their existing beliefs. Or specialisation bias, where they overvalue their own specialisation and potentially devalue other specialisations. Prosecutorial bias, where they select evidence selectively and they treat it selectively when it supports their priorities and they discount it when it doesn't. There's also missionary bias, where they have a certainty in their own moral and intellectual righteousness that directs their judgment. And finally, there's something called a noble cause bias, where they have a desire to save others, and this creates an end justifies the means mentality. And all of this can combine for that medical scientific experts can take the position that public health trumps all other considerations, particularly social considerations, economic considerations, human rights, civil liberty considerations. And that in turn can create the situation where, absent other voices, public health measures that are focused purely or predominantly or almost exclusively on the public health considerations, those measures risk being overly broad and unnecessarily wide-reaching. And as I mentioned earlier, those other voices are largely absent, or at least muted or circumspect. Parliament, the courts, civil society don't engage in the vigorous debate for fear of being perceived to be acting contrary to the public interest, which has been defined almost exclusively in terms of public health and measures of death and infections. So in my paper, I go through that argument and I conclude by saying that managing a pandemic involves balancing not only health, or taking into account not only health considerations, but balancing them with economic, social, human rights and civil liberty considerations. And that is inherently a political decision. Balancing, trading off, weighing up those considerations is an inherently political decision. I therefore argue for a separation of powers, for want of a better term, to separate the power to declare the existence of a public health risk, which is an inherently medical or scientific decision and should be made by the medical scientific expert, and to separate that from the decisions about what to do about the risk, which, as I've argued already, is an inherently political decision. But I also argue that both the declaration of the emergency and the directions that are made to deal with the emergency require greater and more timely parliamentary supervision than is currently provided. And I argue for some automatic triggers of that parliamentary supervision, remembering, as I said at the start, in a parliamentary democracy, the executive exercises significant control over when and how the parliament sits. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. That was very insightful, and it made me hark back to Plato's ideas of the philosopher kings, and that they were the best people placed to make decisions about what happened in the country. And what you're suggesting is that we're having a sort of modern philosopher king, but it is the public health doctor king who makes those decisions. And in the UK, we've been wrestling, nearly taking this from the opposite direction, which is looking for greater scientific input into the lawmaking process. And I know that Nyasha has been looking at that. But I just wanted to pick up one particular point. Under the Australian system, are the medical experts actually making the law, or are they simply giving advice to governments which then follow?
We have effectively 9 jurisdictions, a national government and state and territories. It does vary between them, but there are some jurisdictions in which both the declaration of a public health emergency, the existence of a public health emergency, is made by the jurisdiction's chief health officer. And that declaration then enlivens emergency powers which are exercised by that jurisdiction's chief health officer. So the chief health officer is effectively anointing him or herself with the emergency powers. Now, we would be naive to think that they don't discuss it and consult with their political masters. But a common refrain from our politicians, our Prime Minister and our Premiers, is, I have no choice to do this. This is the decision of my public health officer. And even in jurisdictions where the decision is vested in the politician will say, I have no choice but to do this. This is the advice of my chief health officer. So in some jurisdictions, it is absolutely their decision. In other jurisdictions, they are the chief and primary advisor.
And you also listed some of the risks that would arise from the scientific experts making decisions, and you talked about the various biases. Is that something which would also apply if a minister was making those decisions? Is he also not likely to be subject to those same biases, or is there something about the political decision making that insulates it from those biases which aren't insulated when the medical person is making them?
Look, I think we're all subject to biases. I don't think there's any of us who aren't subject to them. I think, though, that within the community, I think there is a perception and a level of trust in the medical scientific expert that presumes that they have somehow, their expertise somehow insulates themselves, at least from the political biases and other biases. And the point I just want to make, I want to bring out is that they may not share the same political biases that the elected politician does, but they have other biases. And one of the points I talk about in the paper is that in Australia, you know, when we have those press conferences, the two numbers that we are constantly given every day we are given the number of new infections and the number of new fatalities. But if we were at that same press conference also given the number of people who lost their jobs, the number of bankruptcies, the number of suicides, the number of domestic violence, I wonder whether or not we might have a different perspective or reach a different balance and a different conclusion. And so my issue is that the medical scientific expert measures things in a certain metrics, but those metrics are not holistic.
I think Ittai has a question. Ittai, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask it.
Thank you, Ronan. So thank you very much, Eric, for a fascinating presentation and very persuasive and illuminating, in my opinion. It's interesting that us as legisprudence scholars, we've been preaching for evidence-based decision-making and more scientific-based decision-making. This is one of those careful what you wish for cases, right? But I wanted to ask you about something that you said at the end of your presentation. You talked about the need for parliamentary oversight, and especially in the context that you mentioned, that I reached in my own research similar conclusions about Australia. There were lapses or significant times where it seems that Parliament was missing in action. And the question is whether the combination of these two phenomena make it even more dangerous, because in my perspective, I have no quarrels with health experts saying, you know, we want to take the most extreme position to protect health. I mean, that's their role and that's their agenda. And ideally, the place that you'll hear other perspectives, and then you see, you know, people from the, you know, as you said, you know, people getting bankrupt or people with domestic violence problems, etc., raising their voices should be in the parliamentary committees. So maybe the combination of the two in Australia is what exacerbated the situation.
Look, I agree with you. I think that the two have operated. I should also say that Australia has actually managed the coronavirus, I think, remarkably well compared to other jurisdictions. So I'm actually not necessarily criticising the decisions or the outcomes, but I think, you know, the process is important and the checks and balances are important. So, you know, you're right. I mean, because we have a parliamentary democracy, the executive, which has the majority in the lower house of our parliament, determines when, or at least when the lower house sits. They suspended Parliament for a significant period of time, and Parliament only sat literally for a day to pass significant legislation that had been agreed beforehand and then rubber stamped in the Parliament. And our national Parliament is currently, again, not sitting on medical advice that cautioned against representatives travelling across the country, that the travel of the representatives themselves represented a health risk. What our Parliament is not doing, which I think is unfortunate, is they're not using technology. So when they can't sit in person, they're not sitting. Some parliamentary committees have started to operate by video, but the main chamber of Parliament, if it's not sitting in person, it's not sitting at all.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. It was a really fascinating talk, and I think it's a very useful corrective to the perspective that we have in the UK on the primacy of scientific advice. So it's very useful to hear a different perspective and a suggestion that, I like your turn of phrase, autocratic technocracy and the risks of that. The final thing that you were mentioning leads on quite well to my colleague Ittai Bar-Siman-Tov's presentation. I should say that Ittai, as well as delivering a paper, he is my co-editor at the journal Theory and Practice of Legislation, and he has done a lot of work on this subject, and he's done a lot of work on the action and the sitting and the activities of legislatures during coronavirus. But I'm looking forward to what he has to say now on the interaction of coronavirus and the work of legislatures. Ittai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ronan, for this very kind introduction. Now I can only disappoint, so maybe I should stop now after such a great introduction. So as Ronan said, my paper, which will be published in the Theory and Practice of Legislation, talks about how and analyzes how the COVID-19 or the novel coronavirus disease has challenged legislatures. And one of my arguments is that when the pandemic began, the World Health Organization said we're sounding the bell that that there's a serious health risk, and then there were others who said, oh, there's significant economic outcomes, etc. But at least for a while, there was not enough attention to another victim of the pandemic, and this victim we found is legislatures. And we started seeing that, and some NGOs and democracy groups have started to sound the alarms as well and saying, listen, we noticed that, for example, according to one estimate, in April, 2 billion people around the world lived in countries where parliament was shut down or significantly limited due to the pandemic. So my goal in this article was to try to analyze how and why legislatures are challenged by the novel coronavirus. And today in this short presentation, I will present only parts of the first half of the article, and hopefully will give you at least a taste of my argument, and hopefully also an appetite to read the article itself in our website. So let us begin. So I don't have, I think at this stage, to say anything, what is COVID-19, we all know. That my only point that I'll mention about it is that we know that currently there's no cure or vaccine yet in the market. So what governments have done around the world is non-pharmaceutical interventions and mostly social distancing. And countries around the world have said that, among other things, there's travel bans, as Eric has already mentioned, and there are also limitations on assemblies. And this runs into a big conflict of legislatures and what legislatures are all about. Because if you look at legislatures' institutional features, even more than the executive branch, the whole point of a legislature, which is often called assembly, right, or Congress, or in Hebrew, or the word Knesset means gathering. The whole idea is to gather a lot of people, in many countries, hundreds of people, in one relatively small room to debate with each other, vote, and decide. And for this reason, parliaments are very ill-equipped to deal with the idea of social distancing and with the countermeasures that governments adopt against COVID-19. What makes the situation even worse is that most parliaments have quorum rules that say that it's illegal for them to operate if there's not enough people in the room. And at least traditionally, in most countries, it was interpreted meaning physical presence and not remote presence. So this is the first challenge. The next challenge is if you look at the features of COVID-19 on the one hand and the demographic traits of legislatures on the other hand. One of the things that you already know about COVID-19 is that it's not dangerous, equally dangerous to all sections of the population. It's mostly dangerous to older people and also more to males than females. The thing is that legislatures tend to be older than the rest of the population, and they tend to be more male than female. So they tend to be in higher risk groups than the rest of the population. And their job, of course, means meeting a lot of people, shaking hands, etc. So they're actually in a greater risk group than others. And we already see evidence from around the world that there were parliaments where quite a few parliament members got infected. In France, over 20 parliament members were infected by COVID-19. In Iran, at least 24 parliament members, including the speaker, were infected, and high-ranking politicians even passed away. We all heard, of course, of Prime Minister Boris Johnson being hospitalized due to COVID-19. So it's not only institutionally difficult and challenging, it's actually dangerous for legislatures to operate. But if you think this is the problem, we have another problem, and the problem is overestimating this risk. And again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that it's a fake risk. I'm not one of those, coronavirus deniers. I'm saying there is a genuine risk, but my argument is that along with the real risk, there's also a real risk of overestimating this risk. Now, what do I mean? I mean that if you look at the risk perception scholarship, you see that COVID-19 has all the features that might bias our ability to make just what Eric told about evidence-based, rational, correct risk assessments. And it has many features that would, I mean, you can make the mistakes both ways. You can see in Brazil and the US, and this is for you, Jim, that the presidents have underestimated the risk, but there are features of COVID-19 that are more liable to cause people to overestimate the risk. And again, you can see in the article, there's a lot of support from the risk perception and risk analysis scholarship supporting this argument. And my claim is that this is even exacerbated by the media. And here I want to give just two very brief examples. Let's begin with this example, and this is a tribute to you as Australian Eric. You can see this taken from the BBC.com news website. And this is only one out of at least 400 international newspaper reports about basically a guy who coughed in Parliament, okay? Can you imagine in any other time that a guy who coughed in Parliament in Australia, the entire world, CNN, BBC, Sky News, Guardian, etc., will cover this story? And now look at this report. You can see the biggest part is you can see a video. It's almost 3 minutes that you see this guy coughing. You see the title coronavirus, right? And then coughing fit in Parliament. Now I'm giving you a free medical eye medical examination. Let's see if your eyesight is good enough. Look at the bottom right here. It says he was tested for COVID-19, but the result came back negative. So there's a no story here, right? A guy coughed in Parliament. It turned out that there's nothing to do with COVID-19. He's negative, and still the whole world talked about it. Now, you can say this is just an anecdote, but my argument that this hysteria and panic actually impacted how parliaments operate. And here I'll give just one example. Now, take a look on this. This is from a newspaper in Kenya. You can read it for a minute. You see, panic hits Parliament as 17 MPs test positive for COVID-19. And what happened there? The Kenyan Parliament was about to have a special meeting, a sitting to discuss the coronavirus. And then news reports of Parliament members being infected caused panic, and they decided to postpone it or actually cancel it indefinitely. That was the decision. There was only one minor problem. In the very next day, it turned out that this was fake news, and none of them was actually infected by COVID-19. What actually happened, that Parliament, as another newspaper has put it, was hit not by the coronavirus, but a massive virus infection fears, okay? So the danger to parliaments is also the danger from fear from COVID-19. So again, I'm not saying that the risk is not real. I'm saying that parliaments are challenged by actual and real health risk, but I'm saying that they're also challenged by coronaphobia, which could cause them to close parliament, even when it's not justified and beyond what's justified. And this is not only from Kenya, we see it from around the world. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, so I'll just say very, very briefly that we conducted an extensive separate study that checked the operation of parliaments in all countries in the world with a population of over 1 million, which means 159 countries. And we have shown, we tried to measure, among other things, the extent of parliamentary activity on the one hand, and the extent or the severity of the pandemic on the other hand. And we found the amazing finding there is actually absolutely no correlation between the severity of the pandemic and the decision to close parliament. In some countries, parliament was closed after 1 or 2 cases, not of parliament members being sick, but generally of 1 or 2 cases, confirmed cases in the entire country of people getting infected. And Eric mentioned Australia. In Australia, the original decision was to suspend the national parliament for 5 months because of the risk of COVID-19. As he said, since then they came back and enacted a bit, but this was the original decision that in retrospect, we could say was a bit exaggerated, especially that you can consider, as Eric said, alternatives, and closing a parliament for 5 months completely is, of course, should be the last resort. There are other options such as remote voting, as we mentioned. Okay, now what is, and I'm getting to the end of my presentation. The problem is that what we've seen so far is that parliaments are really challenged by COVID-19. We saw that it really is in clash with their institutional features. It endangers them, giving their democratic features. They might be too daunted or afraid to operate. So it's actually very difficult for them to operate. And what happens? We know that in government, there's no vacuum. Who fills this void? The executive branch. And we know from previous cases as well that there's a tendency in emergencies that the legislative branch is becoming weaker and more susceptible to power grabs by the executive branch. And this is something that we have already seen in the COVID-19 pandemic around the world as well. There were two wonderful presentations in our previous webinar, and you're welcome to read those articles by Elena Grillo from Italy and from Jan Petrov from the Czech Republic, that they wrote extensively about it, how we see power grabbing by the executive branch throughout the world. And the important point that I want to make here is that we see it everywhere. So this time, this is, if previously I had a tribute for Eric, this is a tribute for our Hungarian friends. This is, of course, the Prime Minister of Hungary. Woman, he became the poster child of heads of the executive using the coronavirus, or at least claims that heads of the executive branch are using the coronavirus to grab more powers at the expense of the legislature. And this received a lot of international attention. I won't go into details because you'll hear about it very soon today in the last presentation. But my point is that we see this around the world. And even if we talked about the poster child of power grabbing by the executive, here's the poster child of, or at least used to be the poster child of, this is Justin Trudeau, if you don't know, a prime minister who is from the Liberal Party, from a stable constitutional democracy, not some place that you think, oh, okay, a crisis might completely dissolve the balance of powers between the legislative and executive. But even in Canada, there were efforts by the government to use this opportunity for inappropriate power grabbing. Again, I don't have time to go into all the details, but you're welcome to read about it. But the point is that we did see evidence of this happening in Canada as well. Fortunately for Canada, it's a stable enough democracy that there was enough public and parliamentary pushback that the parliament...
Ittai, if you could conclude soon, please.
Yes, thank you. Parliament was able to push back, but as David Dizenhouse said, the example that it's not only Hungary, but also Canada shows that this temptation by governments is omnipresent. So to conclude, I've shown that parliaments are really challenged by the novel coronavirus. In many respects, it's a novel challenge for them. But to conclude in a positive voice, I don't want to say that I think that parliaments cannot live up to this challenge. And in fact, what we've seen also in our study, that most parliaments, especially in democracies, do live up to this challenge. And it is crucial that they will, because parliament is the vital organ of democracy. Thank you very much.
Ittai, fascinating as ever, and perhaps I was too nice to you when I introduced you. I won't be so complimentary next time. An interesting theme, I thought, really, from both your presentation and from Eric's presentation on the risks of over-exaggerating the crisis or leading to, not that we have not doing enough, but we're doing too much. But I have one particular question for you, and that is, do you think that the quality of legislative debate and scrutiny suffers if parliaments aren't physically sitting together?
So this is a million-dollar question now that everybody's debating in the moves to virtual parliament. And of course, the UK is the amazing and most interesting step of they resisted, and then they went to a semi-virtual parliament and then went back. And this is exactly the debate. My own view is that there are many other alternatives than going virtual. And in many parliaments, including the Israeli one, they're spacious enough that you can maintain social distancing and still do completely safe parliamentary operation without forsaking the physical presence. So I think, and sometimes some parliaments around the world went to different venues, but still met physically. So I think still I would prefer physical meetings, because I think it does impact the quality of lawmaking, does impact the quality of debate, it does impact the quality and the extent of representation. And also it is crucial for another thing, which is what you supposed to do in parliament is also the compromises. And often the compromises do not take place in the plenum hall where everything but actually in the cafeteria or in the halls behind the plenum hall. And this could really suffer. So ideally, I think physical presence is still preferable, but parliaments who considered either closing down completely or virtual, I think it's of course a mistake to close down. I think this certainly should be the last resort, and virtual meetings are by far better than closing down parliament.
Thank you. And can I suggest to our audience, if they have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll hopefully have a chance at the end to address those. But I know that Eric had a question for Ittai. Eric, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ittai. I found that fascinating, and thank you for the continual references to Australia. We sometimes wonder whether or not we get lost in the greater scheme of things. A number of times you made you gave examples that showed power being concentrated in the executive across both what I would call strong democracies, and I like to think that Australia is a strong democracy, but also in countries where democracy has been under threat for a significant period of time, such as Hungary, for example. And a number of times, and I'm not being picky, but a number of times you use the words, a power grab by the executive. My question for you is it so much a power grab, at least in strong democracies, a power grab by the executive, or maybe an indication that parliamentary systems are fundamentally inadequate and ill-equipped and ill-designed to deal with these issues? And maybe it's an issue about us rethinking what is the best design of a parliamentary system going forward?
Okay, so this is another challenging question. I won't say that this is the $1 million question, because I gave that to Ronan as well, but this is, I think, another one of the major questions now. And I have a very strong opinion, but maybe I'm biased because I'm a legislation scholar and I believe in parliaments. But I think that one of the most dangerous things we see around the world nowadays, that people are saying, oh, we wish we were like China. It's so great to have a very strong authoritarian government, and you don't have to deal with all this democracy and all this parliament getting in the way. And you see those kind of claims by not only in authoritarian countries. Just one example, The Lancet, which is one of the leading medical journals in the world, their editor in his original editorial said, oh, the coronavirus is just like a flu, it's nothing. And then he went to saying we must take very strong measures and forget about civil liberties. And then he gave an interview saying, oh, we all have to learn from China. So this is really frightening. I mean, serious people are starting to talk like this. And I think this is a mistake. I think one thing is that we've seen recent research showing that actually democracies deal better with pandemics than autocratic regimes or dictatorships. But also, I think that there's three arguments why parliaments should be in the picture. One is that even if we suffer a bit in the effectiveness, exactly what, as you said, I mean, if dealing the most effectively with the virus is only one of the considerations, and separation of powers ensures other things like democracy and civil liberties and other consideration taken into account. So it's a price worth paying. That's the first argument. The second argument is that I disagree that they actually stand in the way of effective responses. And I think they add two important things. One is transparency. And we see, if you take the China example, one of the criticisms against them is because they're not democratic, they first start, when it started, they tried to suppress the information about it. And arguably, if they would not have done that and they were being more transparent, the whole world would be better equipped to deal with it in time. So transparency actually is good for dealing with pandemics. The other thing is that, as you exactly said, there might be a bias that the government thinks they know best and they know everything. And in fact, in Parliament, this is where you hear other opinions, including from other medical experts. In Israel, we had that we had the Organization of Epidemic Experts in Israel coming to Parliament committee and saying, listen, what the Ministry of Health is telling you is wrong. Here is a better plan. And of course, privacy experts saying, the type of surveillance that the government suggests is actually bad. And we came up with a better surveillance system that would protect health to the same degree, but would be more proportional and less infringing on privacy. So I think that Parliament could actually add to better decision-making and more effective responses.
Thank you, Ittai. I'll now turn to Dr. James Maxiner, and I think Ittai has just thrown down the gauntlet to you, James, by saying democracies are better at handling the pandemic than autocracies. But perhaps you might be able to give us your opinion on that, as you had a very interesting thesis on the government of men, not laws. Over to you, James, please.
Do you want me to start responding to your immediate question? Let's see.
Well, I think it was more of an introduction into
okay, very good.
Your presentation.
Okay, very good. The reason I was going in that direction is because actually the United States being the country it is, you can find evidence in both directions. And I'll try to keep this quick so there's time to respond to the rest. So I've been given we are looking here at basically what is the role of the Rechtsstaat, the state of law in today's world. Posted to the association's website are some guidelines from the German Association about that. And they're basically looking for a parliamentary role, I think. But the program itself is talking about looking at the best legislative response and what is the role of different people. Now, I've been given a most difficult situation in that the United States is changing constantly from among all of those different things. And perhaps the most important thing is, if you'll notice here that when we submitted our responses to the call for papers, that the United States and the European Union were really rather similar, but look at what's happened since. And that politics actually explains a lot of that. And so my feeling is here, where before we had a similar situation, today, the situation in the United States is dire. We have 140,000 deaths. We're calculating now it will be between 250,000 and 300,000 deaths by the end of the year. The infections in one of our states are higher than in the entire European Union. Well, so I'm changing the question rather than looking to how it is that we could find the best out of the United States. How is it that the United States could be one of the worst responders? Here it's the wealthiest of nations. Its medical research capabilities are among the best. What went wrong here? Well, Professor Cormacain put the prescription in his paper in the language of COVID-19. The COVID-19 he wants to keep emergency legislation socially distant from ordinary legislation. So following up on that, Ittai mentioned that the parliamentarians are vulnerable. Well, the whole United States system is vulnerable and high risk. The legal system in the United States is immunocompromised host. And that's true in the legislature, the executive, the courts, and federalism. All of these things have underlying problems in the United States that literally go back to their not being solved in the 19th century after these institutions were created in the 18th century. So I'm going to try to bring a little bit from each of those to you now. And the basic theme is the problem in the United States is simply what I would call elementary legal methods. And that is the organization of authority is the backbone, is the rational backbone of a legal order structure. That's elementary learning in Germany and the students' textbooks. So what happens when the rule of law fails, you no longer have a government of laws, but one of men. And that's what you see in the United States today. And yesterday was a good example. Well, to get quickly to the point of the whole presentation, what's been the American legislative response? It's been 4 different, or 54 different, depending upon you look at it. The Congress has been basically inactive, but it's passed 4 and is just now taking up the 5th of gigantic appropriations bills. The European Union's 750 billion euros is just a little tiny speck. The United States Congress has already passed $300 trillion and is now considering another $1 to $3 trillion. But it has done no substantive measures. The president has acted with a lot of talk. He's threatened a lot of executive orders, but he's actually done very little with executive orders. We have seen the scientific role in the federal health authorities, but they've all been in non-binding guidelines. And the president has sought to suppress them. He has actually undermined them. Only last night did he finally advocate masks. He'd actually been opposed to masks as recently as the day before. So meanwhile, he's sought to shuffle all of these responsibilities over to state and local governments. And that means 50 states, territories, but mayoralties too, municipal governments. So I'm going to go through the 4 areas as quickly as I can. The United States Congress is dysfunctional in the best of times. The United States does not have a legal system as you think of it. The laws are not organized one together very well. The bills, the laws are drafted not by the ministries, but basically by the congressmen themselves. And that's what you get in COVID-19. We have basically Congress's function has been to dole out a whole lot of money based on private deal making between the leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the leader of the Senate of different parties. They have to satisfy Donald J. Trump, though, who can veto any of them and has his own ideas. So it's really a 3-way negotiation. So far, 3 million. They're closed room deals. Democracy, forget it. Meanwhile, you have to deal with the executive. The United States president is king. That was true when the country was founded. We didn't know of a parliamentary democracy in those days, such as one has. So it's gone back since the start of the country, an undemocratic selection in the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than did Trump. There's minimal control over him. The impeachment system has not worked. All of that we've just seen in Donald Trump. It makes him feel very uncomfortable, but he's in effect little checked by law. That's the president of everybody. I mean, it's not just Trump. Well, Trump himself is an incredible personality that you would never believe could ever be a president of any country or mayor of any city. His niece just released a book in the last week, which he tried to suppress, in which he writes about how her family created the world's most dangerous man. Remember, he has the control of the nuclear button. So he is the world's most dangerous man. He has been totally focused on this without any regard to the actual public health danger, but only to seeing it as part of his election. But laws don't hinder him. He asserts powers that he doesn't have. He claims knowledge that he doesn't have. He rejects all oversight. Just this morning, there's a big concern because he has been invoking federal forces unmarked with no identification of what federal unit they come from, first in Washington, D.C. itself, which is a federal enclave, but now in Portland, Oregon. There is real concern that if he wins, or rather if he loses, he will not give up the government. That is the essence of a government of man. He is the autocratic autocrat. His strategy at first was to ignore it, to pretend it didn't happen. Now his strategy has been to try to make the states responsible for it. So he cannot be blamed. From the earliest days, the governors pleaded for a national plan that would coordinate things, but that wasn't of his interest. Only last night, literally 5 o'clock last night, did he change his tune a little bit. Well, as far as an executive government goes, the United States, long before Trump, did not have a well-organized federal government. It's not addressed in the Constitution. There's very little systematization. It was set up to fail. And with Trump, he's only made it worse because where Lincoln spoke of having a team of rivals, not Trump. Trump is there. He wants the Attorney General not to respect law, but to respect his command. He's fired inspector generals. I mean, to live in this country for the last 6 months, you could not believe what has been going on. We don't have the 1933 Reichstag Enabling Act yet, but who knows? Now, the interest of the other people here, though, is the health agencies. The United States Center for Control of Infectious Diseases and Prevention, CDC, has been a world leader. This gentleman, Anthony Fauci, has been sometimes allowed to speak. He is not the head of that organization. Has a different one, but the public respects him more. 75% of the public in latest polls trust his views and not those of Trump's. So what's the relationship between these two? Well, most of us thought that he would be fired, actually, because he, at press briefings, would contradict the president. Very carefully, though. So there's no national authority that's been able to adopt any kind of serious response to this. The courts have not been useful and are not expected to be useful, as was mentioned, I think, by Dr. Wintholz. They will appear out of nowhere in sort of like, I like the cuckoo clock. Nobody has any problem with it until suddenly it jumps out at you. The court system themselves is terribly ineffective, terribly slow, terribly cumbersome. They'll probably tell us something that's very important about COVID-19 in another 2 or 3 years. It took them 2.5 years to determine that the national healthcare system was okay. The federalist system.
James, could I ask you to conclude in the next minute or so, please?
Oh, okay. Well, what I'm going to have to say in the next minute or so, I will explain to you quickly. All was shuffled over to the governors, and we have 50 governors, and some of them have been admirable. And Governor Cuomo of my state, New York, where I live, would fit in how to build an autocratic technology, as Professor Wintholz was talking about. He has spoken up clearly every day. He looks to having science determine things. That's his common complaint. Other governors just follow the idiot Trump. That's was Florida. So what happened here with respect to the EU is in New York, you saw that infections came way down. In the rest of the country, they tended to follow Trump, who was more interested in reopening the economy than in solving the health problems. And one of the most interesting things here is, although the governor of New York is acting strictly by decree, he's been trying to do what you might expect from a democracy. He's explained all the way along the line what he was doing, why he was doing it, that he was seeking to get the public's buy-in. And so he was saying, yes, there are decrees, they automatically terminate, and he's gotten basically understanding that this would be the model. And in this respect, though, he has done what, again, the prior speakers were talking about. He's looking to science to be the justification. So that's pretty much the end of it. These two little blurbs here are advertisements that were created to encourage people in New York to wear masks. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That was fascinating, and I've really enjoyed reading your papers in draft and as they've developed throughout. I had just 2 questions for you, and the first one is about executive lawmaking. on the process of executive lawmaking? Because it seems the experience from a lot of places around the world has been the executive has stepped in and made the laws. It seems in the US, it's the absence of executive lawmaking. Is that a fair summary of the position?
No, I would say so. It's the action at the, you have to distinguish, or you should distinguish between the national level and the state level. Basically, Trump is saying, I don't want to think about it. He's uninterested in it. And so he has taken very little in the way of executive action. Now his authority on that is rather unclear, but he's basically said nothing. What's happened is it's executive action from state to state or even city to city. And in that case, for example, Cuomo can do just about anything, but only for 3 months, or 1 month, and it has to be renewed. So he has very extensive action. And the governors in the states generally varies from state to state. But in some states, the governor hasn't taken action, and so mayors have. And now the state is suing the mayors for taking action, telling people you have to have masks. I mean, this is crazy.
And then one other question. You mentioned that Congress has been active, but only in the sense of passing huge appropriation bills. Would it have been possible for Congress to pass federal lockdown rules of the sort that we've seen in other jurisdictions? Would that have worked, or is that a matter purely for the states?
No, well, no, I think most people say there could well have been a federal lockdown. I have a wonderful cartoon from 1879 that I was going to show. The problem that's faced there is that the president would veto the bill.
Okay. Thank you very much, James. And I think now we will pass on to our final paper today, which is being presented by Dr. Csaba Gyuri and Nyasha Weinberg, and they will be talking a little bit more about what's been mentioned already, the case of the emergency regime in Hungary. So I'll pass over to them now.
Hi there, sorry, just hitting the unmute button. Firstly, want to begin by saying thank you very much to all the other speakers for some really interesting conversations. And I think it is quite a tough act to follow. So our report looks at how we can interpret Hungary's legislative action. And we began by trying to identify a frame that would help us analyze and understand the absolute kind of bombardment of legislation that was coming out of Hungary. And in order to achieve that, we wanted a kind of systematic approach to interpreting the moves of the Orban government, and drew from political science and the literature on hybrid regimes. So what is a hybrid regime? Well, a hybrid regime is a regime that occupies the grey zone between democratic regimes and straightforwardly autocratical political systems. And what hybrid regime theory does is rejects this traditional notion that there is always a continuum, a kind of movement from democracy towards autocracy, or from autocracy towards democracy, what has sometimes been described as the transitology mindset, and says that regimes actually can take a separate form, that which is described as a hybrid regime, in which a regime can simultaneously combine political repression with competitive elections in a way that is stable over time. So what are the characteristics of these types of regimes? Well, institutions, the legal system, the justice system, the rule-governed state bureaucracies, they do exist and they do matter. Yet the operation of these institutions is systematically disrupted through direct political intervention to tilt the playing field in the favour of those who are in power and to enable them to consolidate that power. Governments may intervene to render uneven the playing field of the ballot box. Elections kind of remain free of outright fraud, yet the manipulations of state institutions and the media to the government's advantage means that the contenders in those elections do not have an equal chance of winning. There are quite a lot of variants within the frame of hybrid regimes, and these include electoral authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, and a liberal democracy. And there's been a lot of debate about how to frame it. Do you take away from a democracy? Do you add to authoritarianism? Or do you try and describe it in a separate way? Hungary obviously is a special case and is somewhat unique amongst hybrid regimes in that it is somewhat subject to external constraints due to its membership of the European Union, actually alongside its position as a signatory of international human rights instruments, as well as it having an export-led political economy where there's a considerable amount of FDI which demand certain kind of adherence to some democratic norms. These constraints then limit the government's use of its authoritarian tools in some ways, but obviously those constraints are somewhat flexible. So why do we identify Hungary as a hybrid regime? Well, since Orban's election victory back in 2010, we've seen radical centralization and concentration of power within the governing elite. And we've seen Fidesz use its legislative dominance back in 2010, a 68% majority, to place party officials in politically important institutions. We've seen checks and balances abolished as members of previously autonomous organisations, the Prosecutor General's Office, the Electoral Commission, the State Audit Office, the Fiscal Council, the State Media and the Constitutional Court, all replaced by those trusted by the party regime. And these informal practices in Hungary have all served to completely restructure the rules of the game within institution by changing actors' approach to and understanding of how these institutions function. So as my colleague Csaba will go on to describe, we think that this understanding of hybrid regimes and the incentives of actors within hybrid regimes provides a helpful vantage point from which to understand all of the actions that the Hungarian government took following the onset of COVID-19. And the aim here is to complement the extensive work from a kind of constitutional legal perspective and help to further contextualize the ways in which Hungary's transformation has taken place. So handing over to Csaba to talk about the specifics of what has been done over the course of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. So yes, that was actually the initial trigger for this paper, that if you looked at the initial assessments on various fora like the Verfassungsblog, it appeared that the government was finally given the tools to initiate a fundamental transformation of the Hungarian political system into a more overtly autocratic regime. Well, these papers didn't necessarily say that this was going to happen, but they say what they kind of imply that this is now solely up to those holding political power. And if you look at positive constitutional law, which we did in our paper, that concern was absolutely warranted. So we agree with this assessment that due to an interplay between ambiguous regulations in the fundamental law and the legislative solution chosen by the governing majority in Parliament in its Authorization Act, did enable the government to rule by decree, amend, suspend any laws without any constraints, or almost without any constraints. I don't want to go into details here. We go into details in the paper, but this has been discussed here before us by Professor Dinosi. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any about this. The major point is that, such an authorization is not an imperative, it's an opportunity. And what we set out to do at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences is what we wanted to monitor what the government is actually doing with this authorization. So we built a database of all these emergency decrees, a very detailed database of them. And here's what we found. Altogether, there were 189 decrees in less than 3 months. So it was an enormous number of decrees. Some of them are really several dozens pages long. So it's an enormous body of law that was created in such a short period of time. And if you wanted to group these decrees, I would group it in 5 brackets. The first the largest body of law is that comprised of emergency laws that initiate and enforce social distancing and can keep the infection rate low. There are different ones, closing schools and universities, about regulating social distancing in a justice system, and many others. These measures, all in all, there's a detailed analysis in the paper of that of these, while restrictive, were not particularly strict by international comparison, as it is also showed by the Blavatnik School stringency index, where Hungary scored in the mid-range in the stringency of these restrictions. The second group aimed at preparing the healthcare system for the epidemic, and that were basically apart from things that was implemented in other countries too, like pharmaceutical companies were banned from exporting certain medical compounds and fast-tracking clinical trials and things like that. There was one decree that effectively put the whole healthcare system into a hospital system into military management. The third decrees aimed at mitigating the economic impacts of the crisis that included tax breaks, moratorium on tax payments, moratorium on mortgage payments, and other things. This is also comparable to other countries' measures. A fourth group of decrees specifically target concrete legal relations. These included overwriting employment contracts in certain industries or markets, even within particular companies. And there was also a government authorization that is contained already at the time in the Catastrophe Defense Act, that enabled the government to basically take over private businesses temporarily and exercise management rights. And the fifth decrees, and the government used this opportunity to take over private businesses. Some of them I will go into details later. And the fifth group are decrees that kind of miscellaneous various areas, not necessarily connected to the pandemic, or very tentatively connected. Some were more connected. For example, one suspended freedom of information requests until the end of the state of emergency. And there was another one that created special economic zones that under this new regulation, industrial developments valued over 100 billion forint, which is about 30 million euros, that are significant regionally. If this is up to the government to declare these developments special economic zones, and that means that the ownership of the real estate on which the development is situated is transferred to higher administrative authority, kind of a regional administrative authority, the county governments, and also the tax income from these developments, which basically means an expropriation of the local government. And it's entirely up to the government to declare these economic zones, and kind of the requirements to make that consideration or the determination are very vague. So all in all, I would say, essentially compare it to the initial assessments what the government can do. The actual analysis of the actual decrees are somewhat underwhelming. We can see that this extremely broad authorization, which is unquestionably there, but not used to its full extent, and certainly not used for autocratic power grabs. And at best, they can describe as a mix of measures that might be questions of policy grounds. They're arguing that different policy would have been more effective to a given goal, or different policy goals should have been pursued, but they are unquestionably legitimate in the sense that they are kind of addressing the pandemic. And this is mixed with opportunistic decisions to disadvantage the opposition, reduce transparency, and potentially enable government corruption. And decrees that we can sort of classify as abusive are one of these special economic zones, because it's only targeted opposition-run local governments, expropriating them, basically taking their major tax income from them. And there was one which is probably the most outright a breach of basic rule of law principles, that the government took over a company called Carton Pack that was a sort of packaging material producer based on this extraordinary authority. This company did supply boxes of packaging to pharmaceutical companies, but it was really very hard to believe that a minor supplier of cardboard boxes is important enough for the pandemic defense. And what was particularly worrying, that the government had a 61% stake in this company and was embroiled in a legal dispute over management rights with the minority shareholders. And the first decision the government took is to kick out the management and effectively solved the legal dispute it was engaged in as a private shareholder. What's the explanation for that? And that's where we think that the two explanations. One of them is that while the government has been inclined in the past to create fake emergencies, to impose authoritarian measures, one is related to immigration. There's a legal framework for immigration emergency. Professor Dinolti writes about it too. A pandemic is a real challenge, as there's actual governance to be done. So we will necessarily find a lot of decrees that actually deal with practical problems that are arising in a situation like this. And the second, and this is where the hybrid regime theory comes in. If you see the Hungarian political regime, even before the pandemic, as a stable hybrid regime, that would explain why this authorization was not used. And I will give three developments with three-part why. One of them concerns the lack of constraints on the exercise of power even before the pandemic, and the other one, two are constraints that exist and continues to exist, one internal, one external. So one of the impression that you had, if you did not knowledge about Hungary, that from these initial writings about the emergency authorization, was that there had been significant constraints, which now were removed. And it's not necessarily true, because many constraints had been formal and empirically non-existent even before the pandemic. First, the government holds a constitutional majority, a two-thirds majority in the parliament, which means they can legislate whatever they want, with the democratic legitimacy of the parliamentary majority. So they don't really need an extra authority to regulate, to government decrees, but they can push the same thing through the parliament. And it's unquestionable democratic legitimacy that comes with it. The second, we have a very pliant executive organs. There are political science, empirical research about this, in highly politicized and very centralized public administration, little bureaucratic resistance. So it also really constrains the government to do what it wants to do. And third, at least the Constitutional Court is widely seen as captured and packed with court loyalists who always avoided the conflict with the government in the past. There's a very strong record of not taking up the conflict with the government. And so these are the lack of constraints that had been there before the pandemic. And the existing constraints, the internal, external constraints. Internal constraints, the question of legitimacy. So as Nyasha already said, Hungary remains an electoral democracy. The playing field is not level. The governments, the institutions kind of assist those holding power to remain in power, but power can be lost through elections, nevertheless. So a fundamentally weakened democratic legitimacy of the government can be dangerous for it long term. External constraints, one is external constraints, EU membership. Don't forget the EU budget negotiations going on. The rule of law was an important point there. So it was not really incentive on the government part to trigger any further scrutiny or breach fundamental rule of law principles outright. And the foreign capital that exists in Hungary is also a very important constraint. We have an open economy with a considerable foreign direct investments. Just one Audi plant represents almost 1% of the GDP. So this really limits how government interferes with private businesses, either through regulation or through taxation. and that limited this.
Csaba, can I ask you to conclude soon?
Yes, I am actually concluding. So even before the pandemic, there was an evidence of this kind of Singapore style, at least the sort of Singapore style rule of law, where there's rule of law for foreign capital, even if there's no rule of law for citizens necessarily. And what corroborates our assessment here is that after we submitted the paper, the government had no issue ending the emergency, but at the same time using its overwhelming parliamentary majority, basically rolled over many of these decrees into normal law, into parliamentary law. So what they used it for basically, as they just connecting to Ittai, is that, well, obviously it was much faster to make legislation this way through emergency decrees, but there's no problem doing the same thing to the parliamentary process for them. Okay, that would be the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Csaba and Nyasha. There is a couple of questions from the audience, but I just wanted to ask one general question to you. First of all, is the question posed at the start of your presentation, do you think that the government is taking advantage of the situation in general terms? Is it abusing its lawmaking powers during the pandemic?
That is a very good question, because that leads us to the basic problem, which I think not just Hungarians, but many countries are facing. How to define abuse of the use of emergency powers. This is a difficult challenge for various reasons. In many constitutional systems, including very established democracy rule of law regimes, many separation of powers guarantees are suspended. Courts give greater deference to executive deliberations. Additional fundamental rights restrictions are possible. International human rights instruments can be derogated. So the parliament executive has more power. You tend to have more power and more unconstrained power everywhere, anywhere, in a situation like this. So that puts it in a very different, very difficult position how to define abuse. It not only applies to Hungary, and when it comes to the Hungarian context, but obviously the difficulty is that using legislative or regulatory tools to disadvantage opposition is not necessarily, it's not nice, but it's not necessarily an abuse of your regulatory powers. So that would be kind of a bit more fine-tuned analysis that we need there. So I definitely think they abused it in the sense. I think the most obviously abuse is this kind of basically making this whole legal process that they had about management rights void. So basically, as a private party, use this power as a state to, end the debate. Sort of courts have nothing to say anymore because there are rules for kind of liability, civil liability for what the newly installed management is, but there's no restitution into the kind of the original legal state. So that was definitely an abuse. So I would say there is opportunistic use of these tools, but that remains within the logic of the hybrid regimes. It is measured and kind of context driven.
Yeah, I think actually just to kind of add some additional weight to what Csaba was saying about there being some abuse. I think you can look here to international law, which we were doing in kind of an earlier draft of our paper before we realized that was just far too much to say, and that would be going beyond the scope of it. But you can look to international law to try and determine some general characteristics which should characterize legislation in an emergency. And purpose limitation is unequivocally one of the issues which keeps coming up again. So the legislation or policy introduced in order to respond to the to the emergency should be expressly limited for the purpose of responding to the emergency. And when you see measures being introduced with kind of nonsensical reasons, which have the express outcome of limiting kind of opposition power, including defunding particular regions because they don't have Fidesz in power, you can identify that there is something ulterior going on in the lawmaking.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my impression on what you had said. Certainly these ideas of buying out opposition businesses for no good reason. I mean, that's one of the classic criteria for exercise of emergency powers. The emergency powers must only be exercised for the purposes of the emergency. And it sounds from what you've said, defunding opposition strongholds or settling scores with private companies is not for the emergency power. I would like just to give a chance to our panelists generally to answer some questions that the audience have submitted. So I'll read out the first one. We've got a couple of minutes. The first one is from Suraj Khan, and he says that in some jurisdictions, especially the Middle East and North Africa, we have weak parliamentary systems, and many of the parliaments do not even have a constitutional role in the declaration, operation, or ending of the state of emergency. In such instances, the judiciary is often to step in to exert oversight over the restrictions implemented. But we find that even in the UK, the Parliament has very little to say about this. And these decisions are being dealt with by purely political actors instead of judicial actors. So there seems to be a demotion of the role of the courts in the extent to which democratic regimes can restrict fundamental rights. So with that preamble, the question is, without effective parliamentary or judicial oversight, is this not just autocracy in a democratic framework? Would anyone like to answer that question?
Should we go let's go in the usual order?
Well, I think, Eric, if you want to go first, and then Ittai or anyone else, if you want to just raise your hands after that. Eric?
I actually think the phraseology of a autocracy in a democratic framework, I actually like that phraseology, because I think that is, quite consistent with I guess the position that I was arguing, is that we have evolved to an autocratic system. In a parliamentary democracy, our parliament has proven to, at least the main chamber of parliament has proven to be silent. It has no constitutional role. It had a constitution. In our system, Parliament drafted the framework legislation. It drafted the legislation a number of years ago. Presumably it went through the democratic process. It was rigorously debated, but the implementation of that legislation has taken place without Parliament's involvement. It's been totally delegated to the executive. The judiciary has performed no role, because the judiciary can only be triggered when someone seeks its assistance. And in Australia, we have had a situation whereby there has been no challenge through the courts of any of the, I think, the fundamental restrictions until very late in the piece, when some restrictions on interstate movement were challenged. So you have both the two main oversight organs effectively left impotent in the process, and the executive therefore does operate as an autocracy within a democratic framework. So I tend to agree with the commentary.
Ittai, did you want to come in?
So I think it's a great question. I agree with Eric, and I think this is something that we see around the world. And I talked about how the pandemic challenged legislatures, but we know that it also challenged courts, including to a certain extent in many countries. Courts were actually shut down because of the pandemic and had a hard time operating. Having said that, I think it is important to say that in some countries we do see parliaments actually taking action and actually living up to their role. And we do see courts that do it in various countries. Tom Ginsburg is now currently doing a very large comparative project, and he shows that the picture is not as bleak as we would have thought. And there are countries that we see legislatures and courts actually performing their duty. I can say, if we have time, very briefly about the Israeli experience, which has been very interesting, that the Supreme Court remained very active almost every major decision was appealed to the court. And the interesting thing that the court did until now is that it's been very differential on the substance of the anti-coronavirus regulations, but at the same time has been very active in types of interventions by the government that tried to evade parliamentary oversight. So basically, when it came to a substantive judicial review by the court itself on the substance of the measures, the court always did not intervene, even saying those are type of measures that in normal times would never pass. But at the same time, it tried to be very active to keep parliamentary oversight active. And to a certain degree, it worked, but it will work only if Parliament will live up to its role and actually exercise its oversight power. If Parliament would not do it, this type of a semi-procedural approach or strong proceduralism and very differential substantive review would not work by the courts.
Thank you, Ittai. James, you want to come in there as well, please?
I beg your pardon?
James, you like to answer?
Yes, I would, please. I would say, I would just question how much the courts should be looked to as adding to the democratic element. I would think maybe totally different ways of looking at things. Cuomo is governing by decree, but he's trying to at least bring around a consensus. And I would be interested in knowing, and I don't have immediate knowledge of this, but in Germany, how you had a crisis cabinet, and the idea was to extend the group, the cooperative relationship, rather than saying who gets to decide what.
And then Nyasha, I think, and then Chaba, if you want to answer.
I think I take somewhat of a longer view on this question. I think that emergency situations clearly require some transfer of power to the executive in order to have the speed to mobilize the types of resources that you need to deal with a pandemic on a global scale. I mean, that says nothing about the efficacy or the approach taken by that executive, but I don't think that there's anything inherent in the process by which an emergency involves a particular state that necessarily signals a long-term kind of transition towards democratic authoritarianism or authoritarianism in a democratic jacket. That said, I think that you have some incredibly useful benchmarks to try and determine whether that is what's going on, and that includes resistance to relinquishing the additional powers obtained by the executive over the course of that period, going kind of beyond the scope of what is deemed appropriate for emergency responses in international law, things that we were describing, like introducing legislation that has nothing to do with the emergency and rushing it past Parliament. But I think clearly emergencies provide an opportunity for executives to consolidate power, but I would caution against assuming that just because you've seen a bigger massing of power, that necessarily will precipitate a move towards authoritarianism. A second very brief point I would make is that the economists are coming to a consensus that quick initial decisive responses to emergencies have ended up enabling states to return to something approaching normalcy more quickly. And I think that if you have a temporary suspension of certain civil liberties, which enabled a long-term restoration of those civil liberties at a quicker speed, then that is preferable to things like what we're seeing in America today.
Thank you, Nyasha. And Chaba, please. Chaba.
Very quickly, I just wanted a bit more provocative here, because I was kind of working my way through this 400-page legislation, which the Hungarian government kind of transformed these decrees into ordinary law, and I was thinking, you know, is it really different from a more fundamental question that in a modern state or a postmodern state, our life is governed by obscure and technical regulatory law over which there is very little parliamentary oversight anyway, that is without an emergency. and very little judicial oversight because it's a policy issue that's not up to the courts. Now, certain countries, I think it also boils down to the legal culture and the constitutional frame. In a country like the United States, where constitutional adjudication and fundamental rights adjudication happening in the normal and ordinary court system, those things are more easily challenged. But in a more kind of civil law regimes where this is kind of confined to constitutional complaint at the constitutional court, that problem will remain even if these decrees are kind of transformed into normal law. And I was wondering whether this whole emergency that we now sort of jolted us made us realize all these enormous powers that our governments hold above us anyway, because it's now clash with human rights in a very visible way here, that it may be even there is a positive development in this sense that kind of realized how legal oversight over this kind of regulatory lawmaking there is.
Thank you, Csaba. We're reaching the end of our time. In fact, I think we're slightly out of time. So apologies to Lang Tai, who had asked a very useful question about the conflict between federal and national levels. Perhaps they might be able to take that up offline. I would just like to thank all our panelists for really interesting conversation about the nature of the legislative response in your own jurisdictions and showing up the difficulties and the challenges in all those jurisdictions. I'm very grateful to the Bingham Centre and the British Institute of International Comparative Law for hosting this series of webinars. Ittai and I, as we said, are editors of two of the editors of the journal Theory and Practice of Legislation, and the full version of all papers that have been discussed here will eventually be published on our website. And if you look in the chat window, Ittai has included a link to that website. So it falls to me now to thank all our panelists for their contributions, and I hope you have all enjoyed listening to these webinars. The BICL and the Bingham Centre is a charity and it functions by way of donations. The recording will eventually be made available of these presentations on the website, and if you've enjoyed it and if you'd like to contribute to their work, there is a link on your screen now which will allow you to donate to that charity. Thank you very much everyone for your attendance today.